The sun stood high over the endless plains, spilling its merciless light upon the dirt road that cut across the dry land like a scar. Dust clung to every surface, to every tired breath, to every weary step, and the sound of cicadas hummed in the heat. There, in the middle of that lonely stretch, a woman fell to her knees. Her hair was tangled with grit, her lips cracked and pale, and her thin arms clutched the small frame of her child, no more than 4 years old, limp with hunger, eyelids fluttering weakly against the glare. The mother's breath shook as she leaned down, pressing her face to the child's hair, whispering words not meant for heaven, but for whoever fate might send her way. "Please," she said, her voice hardly more than the scrape of wind over stone, "let me die here, save my starving child with you." The words floated into the dust, vanishing as quickly as they were spoken. She thought no one would hear, that they would drift into the silence of the prairie, where no answer ever came. But from the horizon, where heat shimmered like a mirage, a rider emerged. A cowboy, lone in his saddle, his silhouette etched against the blinding light. His horse moved at a measured pace, hooves stirring dry earth, the rhythm echoing like a drumbeat through the emptiness. He slowed when his eyes caught the fragile figures in the dirt. He was a man built of solitude. His shoulders carried years of silence, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes deep with the kind of distance only loneliness teaches. When he saw the mother, he reined in sharply. The horse tossed its head, snorting. The cowboy slid from the saddle and stood, dust settling around his boots. For a moment he didn't move closer, watching her, reading the scene as though it were some sorrow carved into the earth. The woman lifted her head. Pride still glimmered faintly in her hollow gaze, pride that resisted begging though she had nothing left to give. The child whimpered faintly in her arms, and her voice cracked once more. "Take her, just her." "I can't," she could not finish. He knelt without a word, his shadow falling across both mother and child. His hand brushed the girl's forehead, feeling the heat of fever. He did not speak right away. Men like him were not quick with words. Instead, he lifted the child carefully, as though her bones might break at the weight of his touch. She stirred, her tiny hand resting against the worn leather of his vest. He looked at the mother then, and though his voice was quiet, it carried the weight of choice. "You ain't dying here," he said simply. "Not today." Her eyes welled with tears, and she shook her head. "You don't understand. Folks won't." He interrupted by offering his hand, calloused and steady. "Come on." Against the pull of shame, she rose. He guided them to his horse, lifting the girl gently into the saddle, then helping the mother climb behind. The cowboy mounted, and with a nudge they rode. Dust rose behind them like a curtain, erasing the place where she had thought her life would end. The ride to his ranch was silent, broken only by the soft breathing of the child against his back and the woman's quiet sobs she tried to hide in the horse's mane. His land stretched simple but steadfast, a modest home, fences leaning yet strong, fields browned by summer but worked with patience. When they dismounted, he guided them inside. She hesitated at the threshold, as though stepping into another man's shelter branded her with sin, but the girl stirred in his arms, so she followed. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather, of a place lived in by a man who needed little. He placed the child upon a bed, fetched water, bread, a small jug of milk. The little girl's lips parted eagerly when the cup touched them, and the faintest smile passed over her face as she swallowed. The mother's knees buckled with relief. "You shouldn't," she whispered. "I'll bring trouble. They'll say things. They'll say I'm shameless, staying here." He sat at the table, pouring water into a tin cup. His eyes stayed on her as he said, "Let 'em say. Words can't starve or feed you. Food can. Shelter can. That's what matters." Her hands trembled as she accepted the cup. For the first time in weeks, she drank without fear that her child would go without. But the town was not kind. The following day, he took them for supplies. Heads turned when the widow entered the mercantile, whispers snapping like whips. "There she is, already under a man's roof. Shameful. She's using him." The cowboy heard, but he did not look their way. Instead, he stood beside her, steady as a mountain, tipping his hat to her openly so all could see. She lowered her eyes, cheeks burning, but when she glanced sideways, she saw no shame in him, only quiet resolve. That night she tried to leave. The shame weighed too heavy. Her pride insisted she could not remain. She gathered her child and crept out into the moonlight, but the cowboy was waiting by the barn. "You fixin' to run?" he asked, voice low. She froze. "It isn't right. I'll ruin your name." He stepped closer, the lantern light catching the roughness of his face. "Don't let their talk steal your breath. You've already walked through worse fires. You stay." Her tears fell silently, but she stayed. Days passed. Small acts began to weave threads of change. The girl followed him to the barn, brushing the horse with hands too small but eager. Laughter spilled from her, fragile but true. The mother began cooking meals, mending his shirts, planting herbs by the porch. Each gesture was more than survival. It was dignity returning. One evening, as cicadas sang and the lantern flickered, a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the windows. In that uneasy glow, she told her story, of a husband buried too soon, of kin who turned her away, of hunger that gnawed like wolves, of shame that hollowed her. Her voice trembled, but she spoke it at last. He listened. No pity, no interruption. When she finished, silence filled the room until he said, softly but firmly, "Storms pass. Soil takes rain. You'll bloom yet." She stared at him, startled by the weight in those few words, and something within her chest eased. The days deepened. She taught him an old lullaby to soothe the child. He taught her to shoot for protection. He shielded her in small ways, placing his hat over her head in sudden rain, standing beside her in town without shame. And though no words of affection were spoken, the air between them thickened with unspoken tenderness. But the town would not let them be. One evening at dusk, lanterns lit in the square, they stood among others. A man cruel and loud sneered, "There she is, the beggar woman, eating off another man's plate." Laughter rippled cruelly through the crowd. Her chest constricted. Old shame rose like fire. She lowered her head, ready to vanish. But before she could, the cowboy stepped forward. His voice cut clean through the noise. "You'll speak of her with respect," he said, his tone like iron drawn from the earth, "or you'll speak to me no more." Silence fell. No one laughed. He turned then, facing her. For the first time, the loneliness he had carried for years cracked, letting truth slip through. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn silver ring, smooth with years of memory. His voice was rough but steady. "I've been walking this road alone near all my life," he said. "Reckon I don't want to any more. Not without you, and not without her." The child's hand slid into his, tiny fingers curling trustingly. The woman's tears streamed, not of shame, but of release. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried clear. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. The crowd stood hushed, stunned by the quiet courage before them. For once, no gossip followed, only silence that honored what had been done. And there, in the heart of a dusty town, where shame had once threatened to bury her, she stood taller. The cowboy's hand held hers, the child pressed between them, and together they faced the horizon. "I tell you now, as one who remembers, that salvation don't always thunder from the skies. Sometimes it comes on horseback, quiet and steady, carrying no promise but presence. Sometimes love is not declared in fine speeches, but shown in the way a man will not let go of your hand when the world spits your name. Bravery is feeding a child before yourself. It is standing when gossip claws at your back. It is choosing love when fear would be easier. And if ever you find yourself on some lonely road, hollowed by shame, remember this. Grace may be nearer than you reckon, waiting in the steady hand of someone who refuses to leave you in the dust.